the Beatles' George Harrison and the Rolling Stones' Keith Richards were the only people on Earth who knew what it was like to be the leading guitarists for two of the biggest rock and roll groups of the 1960s.
The Beatles. This rock and roll group has taken over as...
While they had their own fickle opinions about each other, George claimed there was no comparison between them. In the special edition of Rolling Stone called Remembering George, Richard said he and George had a bond. George and I kind of formed, without talking too much about it, although we did have a laugh here and there, a bond, in that we felt we were kind of fulfilling the same role within our respective bands, Richard said. It was a nod and a wink to say, well, they'd be nowhere without us. So George and I always used to have that thing of, well, how's your end holding up? He was a very quiet and enigmatic guy in many ways. He had a very sly sense of humor, very quiet, but there was always this unspoken bond between us. Despite having a bond, George and Richards were often critical of each other's work. In some interviews, they'd compliment each other. In others, they'd shred one another to pieces. During a 1989 interview with Mark Rowland, per George Harrison on George Harrison Interviews and Encounters, George said there was no comparison between him and Richards. I think he's a great rhythm guitar player, Keith, George said. You know, really, I think he's probably one of the best rock and roll rhythm guitar players. I don't think he's very good at lead, but he's played... This is the thing you see. What I feel about Keith and myself, too, it's not a comparison, but in some ways, what we do is we make records, and the records have some good guitar parts on them, or have some good songs, or good lyrics, or whatever, but basically, you make records. He's not, to me, like a guitar player who that's all he does is go out and play guitar. He writes songs and he makes records, and within that, like, you can't beat a riff to satisfaction, you know what I mean? It's the simple little things like that, and I think he's, I like Keith enormously. I mean, he's great, but, I don't think he's an Albert King or a B.B. King or anybody else. But then again, it's adequate for what he does, and, the main thing about him is he has the confidence, so even if it's shit, he doesn't care.